All right. So welcome to everybody. I thought we'll just dive right in. Hello. Hello, Michigan. So nice to see everybody. Um, I was thinking today, I'm sure you received in via email from YIB that we have a COVID task force that I'm a part of, and Dr. Sarah Abbott, who's also on this call, is also on the YIB COVID task force. And we had a meeting, we've had a couple meetings this week to think about next steps, and last week as well to think about next steps around reopening. And one of the things that came up for me in thinking about this was something that I've been thinking about for several weeks right now. And all being well, and I hope all is well, maybe this will be a shiur or some learning that you can say, we learned it together, but we're never going to need to use it. We don't need to think about it. But I'm not so sure. And so I wanted to spend some time this evening speaking about scarcity of resources in the field of medicine, specifically relating to COVID-19 and what we're thinking about here in Boston, but not exclusively. And I'll just start with a little bit of framing. When at the beginning of March, when more and more information started coming up around COVID-19, I was on a few different phone calls in the New York area in Westchester, where the medical school is where I teach. And one of the healthcare professionals there said, we actually have, for about 5 years, we already have a document around triage and around scarcity of resources and ventilator distributing. It's been on the governor's desk for 5 years, and he hasn't looked at it. And we really need to hustle. And I was kind of shocked. And I think one of the reasons it was very surprising to me is I grew up in Canada. I grew up in Ottawa and Montreal, but I lived in Toronto during the SARS pandemic in 2003, 2004. And SARS was an incredibly terrifying time in the Toronto community. It affected the Jewish community actually quite heavily. And everything changed in Toronto after SARS, also a respiratory virus. And when I say everything changed, I remember I went to a friend's graduation that year and nobody got handed their diploma. Diplomas were all mailed. Nobody kissed a Torah again. All of the kiddushes were canceled in shuls. People were really maintaining distance. And a lot of those practices actually have maintained. Not to the extent of wearing masks all the time. So some parts of the community certainly have done that. And so I was surprised to hear that there had been this effort around triage that had been on the governor's desk for 5 years and hadn't been put into action. And then this morning, as I said to some of you, this is the last week of med school that I'm teaching. And for today's lecture in an introduction to clinical ethics course, lo and behold, the topic was the ethics of pandemics. I've been teaching this class for 5 years. I could never have imagined in my wildest dreams that today of all days, that would be the class I would be teaching, the second to last lecture of the students' semester about the ethics of pandemics, largely surrounding the ethics of allocation of resources. And also for the physicians to be in medical school, part of the lecture today was on the duty to treat. When can a physician say, I'm going to recuse myself, I'm going to step back because I'm concerned about my own personal health, the health of my loved ones? When is it permitted? Is it ever permitted for a physician to say, I don't think that I should be in this role of treatment, of offering treatment, and I need to step back? I had a very interesting conversation with the students this morning. They are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and all of them tried to volunteer in Westchester to help at the front lines. Every single one of them was told that they would make more trouble than they'd be helpful. And so they have not had the opportunity to do that. But they all were insistent, absolutely insistent, that there is never a situation where a physician can say, I don't feel comfortable treating this patient. I'm too nervous about I'm too concerned about my own health and well-being and that of my family. And at the end of the lecture, every one of them had changed their mind. So I think these are very complicated issues and something to think about. And interestingly, in the spirit of Ein Chadash Tachat Hashemesh, there's nothing new under the sun, the Jewish tradition already has a lot to say about this. The vast majority of emphasis or focus on questions of scarcity of resources in modern day responsa is around organ donation and organ allocation. But we're not going to speak about anything specific to organ donation, but we're going to be speaking more broadly about allocation of resources in general. And when you have scarce resources, how do you make the decisions? How do you determine who gets what when? And is there a hierarchy? And how do we determine who has the access to the precious resources that we need? A couple of months ago, in my work and ethics committees here, also at Massachusetts hospitals, I've been on the committees that put together the protocol for these very questions largely around ventilator resources. Unfortunately, we have not had to look too deeply into accessing those protocols. But there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of unknowns about the future and what we will need. So I do feel very relieved that if, God forbid, there is a time where we do have to ask these questions, we won't have to say, oh yeah, we did this work and it's on the governor's desk from 5 years ago, because actually these things have really been put into place. And it's unfortunate that it took this to light a fire under people to get it done, but there have been almost 40 revisions on the documents, and I think that they're pretty thoughtful documents and also imperfect documents. So I wanted to look into some of the halachic sources around allocation of resources. And I should say, and I think this is really important just as a framing, here in Massachusetts, when the question came to the ethics committee of if people's faith traditions would be honored, if they came and asked a question about ventilators or allocation of resources, the answer was, we will try to do everything possible to honor the wishes of a person's faith tradition, but we don't know if we'll be able to. And so I asked the question just to myself, as somebody who thinks every day in all of my work with a halachic lens. I thought, well, you know, what is the point? What is the point of investigating and thinking about what halakha, what Jewish life and living and practice and Jewish law says about these issues, if practically speaking, these might not be questions that are even entertained by the medical community if I were to be a patient and needed this question to be answered. And I struggled with that for a while. And then something interesting happened. In the first few weeks of COVID-19, many people started calling me, asking halachic questions and ethics-related questions around these issues. And I realized that we all are trying to understand the world through whatever lenses and whatever framework we function in. And if your framework is a halachic one, then yes, you are going to ask these questions, even if there are some unknowns about how those questions will be answered and honored in a medical setting. Any questions or comments before I get into the sources? Okay. Early on, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, who's a major decisor in the Orthodox community, a Rosh Yeshiva at YU, was writing with great frequency answering halachic questions. And one of the questions he sought to answer in a responsa and a tshuva was about ventilator use and scarcity of resources. And it's interesting, he wrote the tshuva both in English and in Hebrew, which meant that it was for the amcha, it was for the masses. It was not meant to be only grappled with or only read by rabbis and thinkers. It was meant to be shared with the community. And he did put some footnotes, though not many, but he made some very clear directives. The Orthodox movement is not the only movement that sought to answer some of these questions. The conservative movement put out two tshuva, two responsa in the past week, both that actually are in almost identical to what Herschel Schachter wrote. Very, very thoughtful. And I'm happy to, if you send me an email or write in the chat, I'm happy to send you these tshuva, both in English and in Hebrew, after the class. And when all of the major movements, and the Reform movement, I believe, also put something out, did put out statements about allocation of resources, it signals that this is very much on people's minds. In other words, the way that fraught are often written is in a response to something that is already going on, to make an offering, an explanation, a teaching, or some guidance about something that's going on. And sometimes fraught come out in anticipation of something that is going to happen more broadly in the community. So when it comes to this issue, Herschel Schachter and others have written for this moment in time, but this is not an issue that is necessarily new. I wanted to start with thinking about this idea of triage and medical allocations. And I wanted to share with you something from the Mishnah, from Horayot. In the Mishnah, in Horayot 13a, we read the following. In thinking about hierarchy of who gets life-saving or life-sustaining interventions, this is what the Mishnah shares with us. A man precedes a woman where there is uncertainty with regard to which one of them to rescue or to return a lost item to first. And the woman precedes a man with regard to which of them to provide with a garment first, because her humiliation is great, or to release from captivity first, due to the concern that she will be assaulted. When they are both subject to degradation, i.e., there is also a concern that the man will be assaulted in captivity, the release of the man precedes the release of the woman. Okay. Thoughts? Alarmed faces. Okay, so this is a pretty big and bold statement. Essentially, what the Mishnah is saying is they're defining a hierarchy. In other words, who gets attention when and who gets an intervention when? Who is saved first if there is a situation of somebody taken into captivity? And the Mishnah would suggest here that the man is saved first, all else being equal, if both the man and the woman are both going to be exposed to the same forms of violence or maybe torture. And in the case of modesty, where a woman's modesty is at threat, perhaps in that moment, the woman will be saved first. Does anybody have any reflections on it?
I'm not surprised.
Okay, not surprised. It isn't surprising, I would agree with you, though alarming. And I will say that the piece about it that feels alarming to me, I think, is actually twofold. It's not just the gender issue. It's also just that the Mishnah feels very comfortable establishing a hierarchy of who is going to get an intervention or saved first. Now, I suppose it has to be that way. And in the early days of COVID-19, when I was sitting on the ethics committee, I thought to myself, there's something, I call this the ick factor of ethics. There's something of an ick factor in ethics that we even have to speak about life years and triage and who gets an intervention when. And at the same time, guess what? You need to have these tough conversations, because if you're put to the challenge and put to the test, you're going to have to answer for them. And at the same time, something about the gender piece is confusing. I'll also say the gender piece here presents an interesting conundrum for the medical community. One of the criteria, most medical communities are making these triage decisions based on an approach that both has a point system, by which I mean, this is like the one place in the world where getting points is bad. I guess like your driver's license as well, as somebody who drives too quickly. But you receive fewer points if you are a woman with a viable pregnancy, for example, which is a curious piece in the Mishnah here, because the Mishnah says you save the man first. But interestingly, if the woman perhaps has a viable pregnancy or has the potential to bear children, then it is possible to think, it's kind of curious to think that the man automatically gets precedence over the woman in terms of saving. Can you think of any reasons why that might be? If we take out questions of the discomfort that we have maybe around gender in the here and now. Well, it is possible that men had more than one wife, so that women were a little bit more disposable. It is also possible that men were the primary earners, and therefore there was more at risk if a man and his family network were to have his demise come earlier than a woman. I'm not saying that this is fair or just. I'm just sharing some possible explanation. Okay. So in the Mishnah, we continue as follows. The next Mishnah, and it reads as follows. In terms of this hierarchy of who gets precedence around saving a life, a priest, a Kohen, precedes a Levi precedes a Yisrael, an Israelite precedes a son born from an incestuous relationship, a mamzer, and a mamzer precedes a Gibeonite. And a Gibeonite, a Givoni, precedes a convert, and a convert precedes an emancipated slave. When do these halachot of precedence take effect? In circumstances when they are all equal in terms of wisdom. But if there were a mamzer, who is a Torah scholar, and a high priest, who is an ignoramus, a mamzer who's a Torah scholar precedes the high priest, who is an ignoramus, as Torah wisdom surpasses all. Thoughts?
That must have been written by rabbis.
Right. Rabbis
Sorry.
with great self-interest. Exactly. So it's fascinating. I mean, here we are. There's no question Jews are the people of the book, and education is paramount to, I think, the Jewish identity in time immemorial. But here we have a situation where a real, a very problematic personal status class of somebody in the Jewish community, the mamzer, and we can talk about the mamzer at another time. I think there's an incredible amount of compassion and thought that needs to be put into the status of mamzerut. But this is a personal status issue of this person who, if they are very learned, even if in all other areas of their lives, there's a tremendous amount of prejudice towards the mamzer in the Jewish community. But having this access to knowledge surpasses all. So certainly a really big plug for Jewish education. And also that having some education could be a safeguard. It could be a real safeguard for you in the event of allocation of resources. But what's the problem here? What's the ethics problem with that particular Mishnah around education?
It's so subjective.
Right. It's so subjective, and also not everybody has access to education. So when we think about contemporary ethics, and I have a clinical ethics consult, and I think about the communities of origin from patients that come into the hospital, I think to myself, not only about how they present, but also what access they've had, what risk factors they've had. We had an issue recently where there was a critique of a number of kids who are COVID positive and who came into the ED, and they had been in Florida in March over spring break. So they came in COVID positive right after spring break in March. And the physicians were really frustrated. They were really annoyed. They were like, we don't really want to treat these kids. And why should they get a ventilator if we only have 3 ventilators left in this hospital? And why should they get a ventilator when they knew better than to go out? They were educated. They were thoughtful. And then we have people from, my old community, my congregation in Chelsea, Massachusetts, who English is not their first language. They're living in abject poverty. They cannot socially distance from their loved ones. And they come into the ED at the same time, and they just didn't know about COVID-19. And so in that kind of situation, and there's 3 ventilators left in the hospital, and they're not doing transfers to other hospitals in that moment in time, what do you do? So education is a complicated thing because not everybody has access to the same education and the same information. So let's continue. In Bava Metzia, the Gemara asks the following. And Rabbi Yochanan, what does he do with this verse? So this is going back to a different verse about a different text, a different pasuk that says, and your brothers shall live with you. So the Gemara answers, he requires the verse for that which is taught in a Braita. For that which is taught in a Braita. If 2 people were walking on a desolate path, and I'm sure many of you have probably heard this Gemara, and there was a jug of water in the possession of one of them, and the situation was such that if both drink from the jug, both will die, as there's not enough water. But if only one of them drinks, he will reach a settled area. There is a dispute as to the halacha. Then Torah taught, it is preferable that both of them drink and die, and let neither one of them see the death of the other. This was the accepted opinion until Rabbi Akiva came and taught that the verse states, and your brothers shall live with you. How does he interpret that verse? He says, indicating that your life takes precedence over the life of the other. So what are your thoughts? We have a situation in Bava Metzia where they're recounting this tale of two people walking in the desert. There's not enough water. They have one jug. And the original thinking was that, of course, you share the jug. We're all going to go down together. And Rabbi Akiva, the master, I would say, in many ways of Jewish ethics, says no. And he's, by the way, Mr. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. He is the love your neighbor as yourself all the way kind of guy. And he says no. He says, actually, if the jug of water is yours, your primary responsibility is to yourself, and you drink the jug of water. What are your thoughts? Does this make sense to you? This Gemara always reminds me when you sit on an airplane, whether any of us gets to sit on an airplane again anytime soon, and they make an announcement that if the oxygen masks come down, you first put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on somebody else. And you have this moment, you're like, those are not manners. That is not what I was taught. I'm taught that you always ask somebody else, is there anything that you need? What can I do for you? But in that moment, you put the mask on yourself and then you help a loved one.
Well, but that's partly practical, right? That's practical because if you pass out, you can't help the other person anyway.
Right, exactly. So it's practical. And so why is what Rabbi Akiva is saying, why is it practical?
I always wondered about that, Kamara, because how do they know exactly how far it is to the, they're lost in the desert, and they got, 1.2 liters of water, and they know that you need 1.1 to get to the next town or something, exactly. And how they know this, I don't know, but...
Well, I think what you're anticipating is exactly the point of what Rabbi Akiva is saying, which is they don't really know. But the best chance that person one can get help for person two is consuming the water and going to town and trying to find help. The best chance that person one can help person two is putting the oxygen mask on themselves before they put it on somebody else. Right? So, and there's also an idea of personal responsibility. In other words, we also have an imperative to take care of ourselves and our own bodies in the Jewish tradition. We don't necessarily... We have a strong ethic of caregiving and a strong ethic of kibud av v'em, of taking care of our parents. We have a strong ethic of taking care of those who are vulnerable, but all in the framework of taking care of yourself first. And it's kind of an unseemly thing to say. We're a little bit uncomfortable saying maybe we have to take care of ourselves first. But the truth of the matter is, as Rabbi Akiva says, if you don't take care of yourself first, if I'm not for myself, who am I and who will be for me? In other words, we need to look out for ourselves first, such that we can be there for others. Now, interestingly, when we think about these issues of how we are to be for other people and how we are to be for ourselves, we also have to think about the issue of caregiving and how we make a determination of how we are going to care for one person before we are going to care for another person, if that person is not ourselves. So you have two people who are in need. How are you going to make the determination of who gets what care first or period if we only have a scarce resource? So in Masechet Sanhedrin, in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, we read the following. The Gemara asks, from where do we derive this halacha with regard to a murderer himself, that one must allow himself to be killed rather than commit murder? So we're in a situation where we're thinking about allocation of resources where somebody might have their demise. They don't get the resource. The Gemara answers, it is based on logical reasoning, that one life is not preferable to another, and therefore there is no need for a verse to teach this halacha. The Gemara relates an incident to demonstrate this. As when a certain person came before Rava and said to him, the Lord of my place, a local official, said to me, go kill so-and-so, and if not, I will kill you. What shall I do? Rava said to him, it's preferable that he should kill you and you should not kill. Who is to say that your blood is redder than his, that your life is more worth than the one he wants you to kill? Perhaps that man's blood is redder. This logical reasoning is the basis for the halacha that one may not save his own life by killing another. But what category does that fall into? There is a category where we don't take care of ourselves first. What is that? Anybody know? It's a very limited, a very, very small halachic circumstance called Yahareg ve'al ya'avor, that it is better that you shall be killed than to desecrate. And that is committing murder, that is public idolatry, and that is committing a sexually forbidden act. In that situation, if you are told to kill another person or you will be killed, it is the only place where you're told it is better to be killed than to kill another. That is how strongly the Jewish tradition of halakha feels about murder. What's complicated about this is this very part of Gemara has been used in bioethics quite extensively, actually. The idea that is it killing somebody else rather than you yourself being killed if you're making a determination of that not giving somebody a medical intervention is going to result in their demise, and you are also a candidate for that treatment or that intervention. I would say that the difference in this situation, I think, that does not make it applicable to a bioethic situation in most circumstances, is the premeditative nature of being asked to actively kill somebody, actively end their life, versus a passive lack of intervention. But I'd like to get more into this in terms of looking at some modern responses. So the Tzitz Eliezer says as follows. One is allowed to donate an organ for a scholar, even an organ that life depends on, and by doing so, one will die. And it is considered a mitzvah, even though one is not required to do so. And one should carefully consider if in practice one should allow this, and it is easier to allow it if the recipient is a renowned scholar and is needed by many. Back to education. So what's the Tzitz Eliezer saying? He's saying that you're allowed to donate an organ, and you're even allowed to donate an organ if it's a necessary organ that you need, which will result in your demise, if it is a well-known Torah scholar, like a really well-known Torah scholar. Thoughts?
It's amazing that there's such a hierarchy, because you could go ahead and make an argument for so many other things. For example, wouldn't you make the same argument that you would have to potentially donate this to the surgeon who's going to be able to do that? So why not develop that as a hierarchy? Why is it just the Torah scholar that's going to be able to go ahead and create that world and continue in that person who's been given the exemption?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. One of the things that I felt very strongly about, and I'll share this publicly, that I felt very strongly about was anybody who was working in healthcare or any essential frontline workers should have priority to ventilator access, more priority than to anybody else. And one of the reasons was very utilitarian philosophically. If they could be healed, they could get back into the workforce, and they could, and that was just an incredibly utilitarian, maybe even consequentialist approach. But also to give to somebody the kavod and the respect that they deserve for putting themselves at risk. The Torah scholar. Well, it's a risky business to be a Torah scholar, sure. On some level, being the rabbi of a community, you take on a bit of risk. It's tough going. It's tough going. And at the same time, it looks really different than the surgeon who's actually going to be doing the surgery. I suspect that the meaning here is around somebody who's in such a profoundly high leadership role that they are a change maker, and they are somebody who can offer the protection of many over time if their life is saved. That being said, I think it's actually a very complicated assertion. There's a bioethicist who wrote an article in Tradition magazine. He's a doctor, an MD as well, Dr. Alan Jokowitz, and he wrote in Tradition, he wrote the following. In the 18th century, Rabbi Yaakov Emden also discussed the issue of prioritization from a halachic perspective. In a lengthy responsum, he makes the following points. He is not sure if the traditional preference given to Kohanim is applicable because of the uncertainty regarding the genealogy of all Kohanim. I'm pressing pause here because I just want you to understand what is happening. Rav Yaakov Emden is looking at that Mishnah in Horayot around the hierarchy of kahuna, of somebody who's in the priestly caste in the Jewish community. and is factoring that in to allocation of medical resources in the 18th century. I mean, that's wild. And he discredits it, or he invalidates it based on genealogy, not based on any problem or challenge with a caste of a person, a caste having access to scarce medical resources over somebody else. So hold on to that for a second, because it's fascinating.
Although given the fondness for bloodletting in the 17th century, it might have been advantageous.
Possible.
To be denied medical resources.
Possible. He also says the young person takes precedence over the old person. The healthy take precedence over the sick. The person who is in danger takes precedence over a person who has less than a year to live. And a woman who is God-fearing takes precedence over one who is not. Okay. So first of all, who wants to be the decider about who's more God-fearing, this woman or that woman? I don't know. It's not a job I would ever want. But what's interesting is what Rav Yaakov Emden anticipates are actually the questions that we're grappling with and that we grappled with over the past few weeks in creating protocol. What does life years mean? People who are more likely to have better outcomes on ventilators are prioritized for ventilators. Age is certainly not the only factor. Life years is not the only factor. But actually the factors that Rav Yaakov Emden highlights here are certainly around, some around age, some around healthy over the sick, specifically those who will benefit the most from the intervention, is certainly something that has still been taken care of, considered today. I can tell you with certainty, nobody has spoken about whether people have great belief in God as a criteria for prioritization. Did somebody have a question?
But in the current situation where we really don't know very well what the prognosis of any particular patient on a ventilator is, and we don't understand the etiology of the pathology of the disease very well, how do you make a judgment of who's most likely to benefit?
So in the here and now, there are algorithms, there are certain criteria that need to be met. It's a case-by-case basis. They haven't reached a situation, though they were close, to having to make the most complicated of the determinations. So essentially, people who are thought to have some benefit have been able to access ventilators because there actually has been enough up until this point. That being said, there are trends that are revealing themselves somewhat, but you're right. There are many unknowns. This is very poorly understood. We're still very much in the infancy of understanding COVID-19, and therefore we don't know necessarily who is going to fare better or fare worse.
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely true, though. I was just going to say, I think like most of the Brigham scoring algorithm, which may be the same as Mass General's, I can't remember if they coordinated or not. And then, I'm not sure what the ones that the Massachusetts government came up with, but most of them factor in comorbidities and the age of the patient. And to your point earlier about, should clinicians who have the potential ability to take care of, more patients, should they be given priority? I actually heard an interesting talk by one of the critical care physicians at the Brigham who was involved in he's also an ethicist and very thoughtful person. He was arguing that they ultimately decided that physicians and healthcare providers should not take precedence because he felt, and the committee overall felt, that they were then injecting bias into the decision making. So before, when I commented, well, a rabbi obviously made that statement about valuing the Torah scholar. I mean, clearly there was some bias there, and I think I think in our scoring systems, we want to be really wary and really shy to avoid doing that, because then it just leads to more complicated feelings, and I think, granted there's the possibility for helping, but I agree with anyway with the argument that was being made about it injecting bias into the process. So at any rate, the point being that a lot of comorbidities, even though we don't necessarily understand the full trajectory of COVID-19, it's very clear who's going to do worse when they have many comorbidities that some other patient doesn't have.
Right. And I would say, just in terms of this conversation about triage and about scarcity of resources, something that has come up time and time again are physicians who are saying, if you're not going to guarantee me a ventilator, then I'm actually too scared to come into work. So then what do I do? And so I think that there are a lot of different angles. One of our scarcest resources are our healthcare providers. Many people have been redeployed into the kind of trenches, so to speak. So I think that there's a lot to think about, but yes, Sarah, you're absolutely right. Comorbidities is a very important piece. I do want to speak about a little bit more before we wrap up today, just a few more points, just to elucidate and to highlight some of the questions about Rabbi Akiva. So the Tzitz Eliezer, another commentator, says as following: rather, the point is talking about the drinking and the sharing of the water. They will, the point is that if both drink, they will each live at least another day or two, which is not the case if he does not give to a friend, who will certainly die in famine. And if so, the same is true in the case of medication, where we do not follow the words of Rabbi Akiva that one life precedes another, and we must distribute equally between them. So the Tzitz Eliezer is saying we do something very different when it comes to allocation of resources. We do not, he would say, no, we do not give, we don't say that one life takes precedence over the other. But interestingly, this is a fraught statement, because there is a precedent to still giving treatment to the person that you think will most likely benefit from the treatment. So there is a conflict with what the Tzitz Eliezer is saying. There's a very interesting ethicist named Paul Ramsey, and I just wanted to share this piece of his, which I think is important. When the ultimate of life is the value at stake, and when not all lives can be saved, it can reasonably be argued that men should stand aside as far as possible from the choice of who shall live and who shall die. Random selection is preferable, not simply because life is a value incommensurate with all other, and not so negotiable by bartering one's man's worth against another's. It is sustained also because we have no way of knowing how really and truly to estimate a man's worth. So Paul Ramsey would say, leave it to lottery. First come, first serve. Don't even think about comorbidities. Don't even think about life years. Just think, who am I to stand in judgment of whose life is worth more than another? And it should just be first come, first serve, totally random and lottery. And interestingly,
first come, first serve,
yes?
and totally random lottery are different, right? Because totally random lottery is, okay, I've got however many patients I've got right now, and I'm willing to, draw lots. The first come, first serve is, Harry is in the emergency room, and he goes first because he's here first, and, Sue, who's coming in an ambulance 35 seconds later, isn't here yet.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And whereas lottery might be flip a coin. And
well, lottery also might be if there are three people
right?
who present in the ED at the exact same time. So which is something that does happen. If you have multiple people in the waiting room at the same time, and they're all just sitting there waiting, it's a bit more of a question, I think. And actually, some prominent rabbis have suggested in this current pandemic that a lottery might be the most just, halachically. Not taking into account clinical guidelines
some
around
of the
comorbidities.
tshuvot from the early days of antibiotics, where it was kind of, okay, whatever judgment you might make if you had them both in front of you, if you've starting the first guy on the antibiotics, you don't take him off it to give it to the second guy. Even if had they shown up at the same time, you might think about that.
Right.
You might have done it differently, but because you're not really allowed to go past saving one person to go save somebody else, maybe.
Right. Well, halachically, that feels very clear, though I can tell you, in thinking about the protocols, these are issues that keep coming up time and time again. These are not decisions that physicians really want to make about having to take somebody off support to offer to somebody else. I mean, these are very complicated issues. I'll just go over two more sources before we wind down for today. The Igrot Moshe says as follows: the life of someone who can be saved and live a normal life gets precedence over someone who is dying and the physician is unable to cure. But the dying patient does not have an obligation to save someone else with his life. And if he was treated first, he does not have to give up his place. So that's to your point, Michael. And that's the same piece that is given in the case of antibiotics as well. I will say that the Tzitz Eliezer immediately disregards the Mishnah around the hierarchy of men and women. Says that he omits this section in his rulings around hierarchy, which I think is just interesting. And then I just want to close with one piece, which I think is a really beautiful piece. I'm not sure if people here have heard of the Rabbi Chaim Sabato. Chaim Sabato is now one of the rabbis at Ma'ale Adumim. The Rosh Yeshiva of Ma'ale Adumim, actually, Rav Rabinovich, just died last week in Israel. A very prominent rabbi, an incredibly important voice in halachic thinking, and actually is the rabbi of my youngest brother, Ariel Kagedan, who some of you know. And I was fortunate. I woke up very early in the morning with my brother, and both of us on Zoom were watching the funeral of Rav Rabinovich. And Chaim Sabato, his student, and now one of the Rosh Yeshiva there, spoke. And Chaim Sabato learned from Rav Rabinovich and also Aaron Lichtenstein at the Gosh. So I'll just read a little bit here. I think it's quite profound. So Chaim Sabato wrote this it's a conversation with Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. Rabbi Shabtai Rappaport said in a public lecture, not in private, that's important, that Rav Feinstein, the grandfather of his wife, ruled that in our present circumstances, we do not follow these criteria, those in the Mishnah of Horayot. Rabbi Shabtai explained that the reason for this ruling was that nowadays it is impossible to rule according to these criteria when we are confronted by the question. I asked myself this point, which brings me to the question, the criteria of the Mishnah of Horayot. Where does it come from? Does it come from values I gained at home, the world of Torah? Or do they come from foreign influences? Practice stringent upon myself and ask myself in these situations, maybe my thoughts come from the fact, this is Rav Aaron Lichtenstein saying, that I love to read Shakespeare or Milton, and maybe they influenced my worldview. And then in the midst of this examination, I say to myself, wait a minute, the Mishnah supports me, the Mishnah itself. Because what does the Mishnah say at the end of Horayot? Talmid Chacham Mamzer, and a Kohen Gadol Am Haaretz. The Mamzer is a Talmid Chacham, takes precedence. The Mamzer Talmid Chacham takes precedence. What does the sentence say? What it says is that everything in the Mishnah says at the beginning on the priorities due to genealogy is erased with the last sentence, and that it establishes that the accomplishments of a person is more important than their genealogy. And that's what Rav Aaron says. I think it's a profound statement that what Rav Aaron says in thinking about triage. In other words, what he's really saying is you must look at the whole person. You're looking at comorbidities. You're looking at where their station is in life. You're looking at who they're caring for, how they can care for themselves. Yes, you are looking at age and stage and maybe life years as well, but you're also looking at who they're taking care of. You're also looking about how they will be in this world moving forward. And I think what Rav Aaron does here is say something incredible, which is try to look holistically at each patient for who they are in that moment as best as we can, not from where they're coming and not maybe their accomplishments, but also who they are in this world and the here and now, and then what they can offer going forwards, who are their networks. And erasing all judgment. In other words, erasing even the judgment of the mamzer, erasing all judgment and trying to see each patient uniquely, individually, holistically, in order to offer treatment in the best way in the here and now. And I would say that is what the protocols that have been established at most of the area hospitals and in New York have really attempted to do. I'm mindful of the time. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week. We are going to be speaking about the ethics of reopening communal spaces and shul next week in our time together. And I hope you all have a good week ahead, a safe, healthy, happy week. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks so much for joining, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Lila.
Okay.
Bye-bye.